Good afternoon, everyone. It's just about a minute before 2 o'clock Eastern here, so we'll be getting started very shortly. And people are still connecting here, so I'll give them another 30 seconds and then we'll get started. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today on an introduction to digital inclusion. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. Please use the chat box in Zoom for any questions about the webinar. If you're having any problems with your audio or you need any other assistance, Priya will be online and be able to chat with you and help you. For any questions on the content, please use the Q&A button to ask any questions, and we will then answer those questions at the end of the presentation. My name is David Herr. I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Partnerships here at Common Look. And I'd like to introduce Kim Testa, the Executive Vice President at the Bureau of Internet Accessibility, as we will be your speakers today. So with introductions out of the way, let's get started on our presentation. So what is the issue? What is digital inclusion? And I think, before we start to answer that and dig a little bit deeper in it, I think the thought I want to leave you with or to have in the back of your minds as we talk about this is really what's the opposite of inclusion, and that would be exclusion. And I think that's kind of the heart of the matter. When we're talking about digital inclusion, we're talking about including everyone and not excluding any group, any particular individual for any reason. So as we go through this, think about inclusion, think about who are we excluding or accidentally excluding, because all of these people are potential visitors to your website. They're potential customers, potential clients. So just kind of think about that as we go through some of the particulars of this. So how many people are we talking about? What are we talking about? And I think, when people hear, disabilities or they hear about inclusion and website accessibility, they think in very smaller segments that you'll think, okay, this is for people that are blind or this is for people that are deaf, because we're familiar with those things. But I think it's best to sometimes look at this on a larger level and really get an understanding of just how many people we're talking about. So the WHO, World Health Organization, has put out some statistics on this, and it's 1 in 7 people or 15% of the population have some form of a disability. So it's 1 in 7 of your website visitors. It's 1 in 7 of your potential customers. So it's not a small group. And I think it's because we view disabilities differently today than maybe we did many years ago. There's a lot of hidden disabilities. There's a lot of things out there that we need to be aware of when we're worried about our digital content. So when you look at just the things we are familiar with, the number of people that have some kind of visual impairment or the number of people that have some kind of hearing loss, these are staggering numbers. It's a large population, and it's something we need to be very aware of when we're working on our content. So the landscape that we find ourselves in today is really this, that despite accessibility laws and regulations and lawsuits and lots of things going on, just industry awareness, people aware of the problem, we still find ourselves today that there's still a lot of websites that have accessibility issues, whether it's their web, their HTML, their documents, their videos, whatever it is. So there's still a large number of organizations that need to do something about this for many, many reasons that we're going to elaborate on. And then the counter of that is there's a large number of people that can't interact with your organizations because of this problem. You know, organizations have the ability to do something about it. The law is pushing organizations to do something about it, but many people don't know where to get started, and they don't know what's required. So we'll define inclusion. You know, it's providing equal access to opportunities and resources, so that no one is excluded, no one's marginalized. Everyone has the ability to do business with your organization. And so if you think about, you know, how people do business with your organization, whatever your organization is, you know, if the process is they come to your website, if they can't navigate your website and find the information they're looking for, they're either going to go elsewhere or they're just not going to be able to find what they're looking for. If the processes that your business does, you know, involve inaccessible content along the way, like we send them a PDF document to fill out. Well, if it's not a fillable form, it can't be filled out online with a screen reader. I mean, the various things we do when we interact with the customers and what information we send them, how we do business with them, is all part of what we're talking about when we're saying digital inclusion. My slides weren't moving. So some considerations, just things to think about when we talk about the various disabilities, because I think a couple of them we're very familiar with, and then some of them we may not be familiar with. For somebody that is blind or has visual disabilities, the website has to be coded so that a screen reader or other assistive technology can interpret it. So what does that mean? And this isn't a technical webinar, so we're not going to go into great detail. But what that means is the web code, the HTML, has to be able to be navigatable. It has to be, the reading order needs to be correct. Images need to have alt text. There needs to be a way that that code can be interpreted by assistive technology so that that viewer can navigate the website and find what they're looking for in the same way that anyone else can. If someone's deaf, we're all familiar with captioning because fortunately now captioning has become mainstream. You see it on TV. You see, it's just a common technology now. So we're all very familiar with it. It's on our cable boxes at home. And it's not just used by people that have deafness, but it's also, you know, used by many other people. So it's an important technology that's moved up. Mobility, I think, is something people don't think about. If you can't operate a mouse or you can't operate a keyboard, can the website be navigated with other assistive technologies? And some of those things we're going to talk about a little bit later here. And then the last one, which I think is something that's just becoming more apparent to people as we move forward, is cognitive disabilities, probably dyslexia being the most well-known cognitive disability. So when we design websites, you know, we need to be aware of that. In fact, some of the newer standards, WCAG 2.1 AA, as one of them that's come out, addresses some of the cognitive things that need to be taken care of in a website so that it can be accessed by a larger audience. So just some of the things for those various things that we just talked about. So with vision, how do people use websites that are blind? They're using assistive technology such as a screen reader that actually reads you the text on the screen and allows you to navigate using your keyboard and navigate a website or a document and be able to get the same information out of it. There's also Braille displays and other tools that will use accessible content properly so that it can be accessed by everyone. On the mobility side, there's pointing devices. There's just using a keyboard only, not using a mouse. There's, of course, speech to text that's become another mainstream technology. As we talked about with hearing, with closed captioning and transcripts and things like that. And with dyslexia and ADHD and things like that, it's really more about awareness. You know, there's certain fonts that are just difficult to read if you have dyslexia. So avoiding using those fonts may be a good business practice. It's probably a good business practice. how you lay out your content so that it's easy to understand, it's easy to find things, are all going to expand the accessibility and the inclusiveness of your website. Yeah, so what are the considerations for people with disabilities? If your website isn't accessible, in effect, you are discriminating against people with disabilities. You are jeopardizing your brand and your reputation. You are probably excluding 15% of your potential customers. And then, of course, there's always the legal liability aspect to all of this. So this is important to do. It's not just doing it because the legal requirements are there, but there's a lot of other impacts to it. So how do people use the web and digital documents? So I'm going to now turn it over to Kim, and she's going to talk about that.
Thanks, Dave. When you think of the website, web-based applications, native mobile applications, so think of anything digital. It's all the same web, it's the same content. However, it's used and accessed in different ways. Many people wonder, can people who are blind or have significant disabilities really use a website independently? And the answer is absolutely yes. If the website or application is built according to the well-established accessibility guidelines, they'll be able to. Another question, okay, so how do people with certain disabilities use websites? Well, the answer to that, there are many ways. Included several assistive technologies like screen readers, braille displays, magnifiers, switches, speech to text, keyboards, and more. We'll review a few assistive technologies and navigation consumption techniques. Another question people may ask is, do we really have to make our website work for in every possible way for someone may use it? Do we have to make our website so that to work for every possible technology out there, every variation? And how is that even possible? Well, the answer to that is it's really not. It's unlikely website operators would be equipped to expand to or expected to do that. But here's the thing. When a website is built to be accessible, it tends to work with a wide variety of assistive technologies and many of the ways that individuals might use it based on their needs and preferences. With the foundation of accessible code and designs, most people, including many with disabilities, it impacts how they use the web or how they're able to even use the website. So the point is, without accessible code and designs, many people cannot use your website, your web-based applications, or your native apps. So to set the stage, let's look at a couple of these technologies together, starting with screen readers. Regarding a screen reader, it turns the digital text into audio, so that's synthesized speech, or tactile, which is that braille output. And it facilitates the navigation of the consumption of and the contribution to the digital content. And it can be purchased, such as one of the big famous screen readers out there is JAWS, or it can be downloaded free like NVDA. And it can come with preloaded devices like VoiceOver for iOS and TalkBack on Android. And screen reader users can use a standard keyboard to initiate commands and type, can use a braille terminal, or many have other setups based on individual preferences or need. For example, on mobile, screen readers are controlled by swipes, gestures, and taps. Also, screen reader users commonly navigate by headings, by tab key, moving from one active or interactive element to another, or using up and down arrows, even lists or tables. And there are other methods, but once again, the bottom line, proper coding, structure, labeling, alt text, and many other things. They're critical to the user to be able to use their screen readers. And that's where following the guidelines come into play for all of this. For keyboard navigation, so getting back to the screen reader. So a screen reader, so when the user engages with it, it will read everything out loud to them, and it'll start with reading the URL out loud so they know where they are. So for keyboard navigation, and many people will use keyboard or keyboard emulators as their primary navigational control and input methods. So imagine not using a mouse. Everything that can be reached, changed, operated, or selected with a mouse needs to work with a keyboard alone. So imagine putting your mouse away and trying to navigate a website just using your keyboard. So with that, every element must work with the standard and expected keystrokes and controls. Also, the keyboard user with sight may also know where their focus is through visual focus indicators. So keyboard accessibility is foundational, absolutely mission critical to accessibility. There can be no claims of any level of accessibility conformance if keyboard accessibility is lacking. A person might use a keyboard on its own or in conjunction with screen readers, magnifiers, or other assistive technology. So this is one area that keyboard navigation that pulls in a lot of the different WCAG guidelines as well. Some of the other common assistive technologies out there, and we've mentioned them a couple of times so far, screen magnifiers. And what they do is it enlarges the text, the graphics, the cursors on the screen. Speech recognition or speech to text, that converts human speech to text and/or navigation and controls. Joysticks are an interesting one. So imagine you can't use a keyboard or a mouse. And this is a lever that's attached to a base, just like a video game. And what it does is it controls the cursor and the navigation instead of the mouse. So that's if someone that has mobility problems, this may be something that they would use. And head pointers, this is another one that, a lot of folks don't think about, but it's a headgear with a pointer on it. And it's usually to make selections on a keyboard or on a screen to select the switches or the buttons or to even move cursors. So the combination of all of these different assistive technologies help make individuals with these types of disabilities, it gives them the opportunity to be able to access your website applications in your mobile apps. And it's that combination of everything with the guidelines and other things that Dave was talking about early. That's where all of this inclusiveness comes into play. So you have to really keep in mind many of these things, and it's not just one particular thing with digital accessibility.
And one thing I would add to this is, so you look at all these different accessibility technologies, assistive technologies, it's not that you have to program your website to work with a joystick, or you have to program your website to work with screen recognition or speech recognition or something like that. You need to code your website to the accessibility standards, and then in general, they're going to work well with assistive technologies, because there's always going to be new assistive technologies that are going to come out. And as new technologies are developed to assist people, those technologies have to rely on standard coding practice that meets the accessibility criteria so that they know how to interact with the website based on there are navigational functions in the website coded in. So the heading levels are coded in, or alt text or reading order or tab order, things like that. So if you follow the accessibility standards, these assistive technologies are going to then be able to be functional.
That's a good point, Dave. The other thing to keep in mind is that as technology advances, the guidelines themselves are going to advance right along with them. So it's if you're following the guidelines and your coding methodologies, all of these assistive technologies should work, and you shouldn't have to, as Dave mentioned, change the code, change how you're using your assistive technology or download a lot of different softwares.
So with that, what are the laws and standards and regulations? So we're not going to take a real deep dive into this. We actually did more of this last week on a similar webinar where we talked about the laws and regulations, but we'll talk about them at a high level. So at least here in the US, if we want to look at applicable laws and regulations, most people have heard of Section 508, and almost everyone is familiar with the ADA. So, those are laws that are designed around accessibility and digital inclusion. But these laws are old, and some laws are older than others. Section 508 has been refreshed, so they've enhanced it. In the case of the ADA has been around for a long time, and it was originally written around inclusion, not necessarily digital inclusion, but definitely disability inclusion in transportation and employment and physical access and things like that. And we look at the ADA over the years, and you think of all the great things that have occurred from that. But what's happened, and the biggest shift has been, the ADA hasn't been rewritten, and it really hasn't been enhanced yet. It's now being interpreted as businesses have transitioned from physical to digital. The ADA is starting to be interpreted more and more by the courts as applying to your digital business just as much as your physical business. So if you think about the wheelchair ramp, so the ADA wouldn't allow you today to build a building where the only way to get into the building is a bunch of steps. There need to be a wheelchair ramp or elevators or other ways to get into the building. So in the same way, you can't build you can't convert from your physical storefront now to a digital business workplace and not expect that digital workplace now needs to be accessible in the same way as your physical building was. So the courts are interpreting the ADA more and more that this applies to the digital world. On the standards side, the regulations like 508 and ADA and many of the others aren't specifying how to do the accessibility. They're relying on the standards. So the ISO, the W3C, the PDF Association, HHS, and the federal government through 508, will call upon various standards. So when you think about digital accessibility standards, the WCAG standards is probably the one that most organizations are starting to hear about if they're not very familiar with it. And that has continued to progress. So I think originally WCAG was 1.0, and it had some very basic accessibility guidelines for websites when they were in their infancy. But as the technology has progressed, WCAG went to version 2.0, which is what the 508 standard and many ADA lawsuits have required as the minimum accessibility standard to be followed. WCAG now is at version 2.1, which has now added cognitive disability testing checkpoints in it in the standard. And 2.2 is under development, and that will continue to advance the state of accessibility. So as Kim had said earlier, when you're fixing your website and your digital content, you're always going to try to use the latest standard because that keeps you the most up to date. But then, something that people have been saying now for a while about accessibility is not a project. You don't go in, fix your accessibility, and you're done, because your website doesn't stop changing. Your content doesn't stop getting updated. So accessibility is a process, and you need to embed that process into your organization's psyche so that once we adopt accessibility as how we do business, it becomes a process. It's something we work on constantly. And as the standards move on, we follow those standards to stay more and more accessible as we move along. So around the world, these digital regulations have become law. We talked about ADA and 508, but in some of the states in California with AB 434, and then Accessible Canada Act and Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities, AODA, EU, Australia, UN, all across the world, digital accessibility, digital inclusion is becoming the law of the land, and that's a great thing. So just to kind of reinforce a little bit about the laws, but not only just the laws and mitigating your legal risk, but some of the other reasons you do this. Obviously, the legal risk is there. There is a competitive advantage, and I believe that's a growing competitive advantage by making your website accessible. If your competitors are not accessible and your website is accessible, it's going to improve your reputation. It's going to improve your brand. It's going to bring in a larger number of potential clients. It's the right thing to do. And it just makes good business sense to do it. You are now meeting the needs of all the users coming to your website or doing business with you, not just a smaller group. And we'll talk more about the legal. What are the legal implications? Well, right now in 2020, there's been people that have been tracking the number of lawsuits around the country, and it continues to go up every year around digital accessibility. There's been a lot of talk about it. There's been a lot of, there's people that go to a website, try to do business with an organization. If they can't use the website, they may choose to get involved in a lawsuit, and they may take you to court. There's also some people that have been going around and sort of taking advantage of the law and doing some flyby lawsuits. So there's been a lot of those. And the courts have dealt with those differently. And there's been some talk of even changing some of the laws to kind of eliminate the fly-by-night lawsuits and only focus on the ones that are truly somebody wasn't able to do business in their jurisdiction or whatever it is. But the bottom line is there's lawsuits out there. People are getting demand letters. People are filing claims against organizations. And you need to be aware of this. You could be the next one that this happens to. So by working on your content now, getting your website accessible, getting your documents accessible, you're freeing your organization from that legal liability, not to mention the business advantages that we talked about. In many cases, people will settle, but in many cases they won't settle, and the courts will come back and require an organization to meet a WCAG standard by a certain time frame. We've seen that in the higher education realm. Many organizations have come back and been put under some kind of a penalty where they have a certain period of time, maybe it's a year, maybe it's 6 months, and they must meet WCAG 2.0 AA, and they must do some other things to get their websites and their electronic learning systems and all those things accessible. This case, many times people come to us and say, well, I've never heard of anybody being sued for this. Who's been sued? What's been going on? And if you do some research, you'll learn that major banks have all been involved in lawsuits, and insurance companies, government agencies, higher education organizations. There's a long list that you can find online of the organizations that have been sued for digital accessibility. But this one was very important in many different ways. And the reaction that Domino's took was interesting, to say the least. I don't know that I understand it, but they were sued by this person over not being able to do business on their website and order pizza, which anybody should be able to do, you would think. You're trying to sell pizza. So this lawsuit came to Domino's, and in Domino's case, instead of saying, yeah, we need to settle, or we need to fix our website, or we need to work on this, it continued to progress through the courts, and Domino's took the position that they didn't need to make their website accessible because it didn't violate the whole public accommodations thing of the ADA. That they fought this tooth and nail, and this went on and on and on all through the federal courts, and it went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rejected Domino's position, sent it back down to the lower court, and basically said, no, we do not see that you have a case for saying that you're not, that this isn't a public accommodations thing. And it was sent back, so now they are in court, and I'm sure they'll eventually be making their website accessible because of all of this. But it was a massive win for disability advocates, because basically by not taking the case, the Supreme Court agreed with the position that no, a business such as Domino's that's in the public domain whose public place of ordering happens to be both digital and physical, and they now are required to be held under the accessibility regulations. So this was a major case, and really kind of shows that, you know, if they can sue Domino's, you can sue anybody. I mean, anybody doing business, it doesn't matter anymore. So just a couple quick things, next steps to you know, creating your content as being accessible. First thing you have to do is you got to audit your content. And when we talk about content, we're talking about everything. I mean, it's not just your website. Your website, the HTML, yes, that's probably first. But obviously, videos, as we discussed, have to be captioned. If you have documents on your website, they need to be made accessible. If you have other content on your website, or you have deliverables after somebody's come to your website that are sent out. Let's say you're an insurance company, so you send a bunch of forms out afterwards, you know, that are emailed to the client. That those need to be accessible. So you know, you have to look at all of your content and audit it for accessibility. And then once you've defined that, you really need to look at the scope of the project. It may be too large to do it all at once, and there's nothing wrong with that. So you're going to prioritize it. You're going to look at your content and say, okay, what's most important? Maybe the most important thing is the website first. And then the second most important thing is the content we send to potential clients that we email out, you know, application forms, whatever it is. And then maybe the older contents, that's archive type content, we can either remove from the website, or maybe it's something we get to after we get the stuff that most people access when they come to our website. So you define the scope so that it's achievable. Then you're going to decide how you're going to do your remediation of your website or your content. You can do it all in-house, so you're going to bring in a third party, or you're going to do a little bit of both. There's nothing wrong with any of those approaches. Then you're going to fix the accessibility errors, and that's an ongoing process, not a project. It's something you'll continually work on. You know, once you've fixed your errors, you do need to be able to track and verify that you continue to be accessible, that you haven't made changes to your website that now have taken you a step backwards. So that testing is important, and we'll be talking in future webinars about ways to do your testing, both manual and automated. And then how do you track and maintain that compliance and maybe check your website against the standards, you know, over a period of time through some kind of an audit. So with that, we're going to go to questions here in a second, but our next webinar in this series is on the 17th, and it's going to be on digital accessibility laws and how they're applicable. And in this case, Jim Rockney from Reed Smith, who's an attorney that's been involved in accessibility lawsuits and defending against accessibility lawsuits, will be able to really give people a lot of valuable information and answer questions on this. So we're really looking forward to giving this webinar next week. And with that, we'll go to some questions. So the first question that we have is, which captioning service or app is being used now for this presentation? Whitney is our closed captioner, so she's doing the captioning right now. So it is a live captioner that's doing the captioning. So there's no app, it is actually live captioning for this webinar. What we will do is we always record the webinar, so after the recording is done, we will then do standard captioning that will be then applied to the recorded video. And the next question is, what would be my checklist to audit my content? Kim, you have any ideas on where to find a checklist for auditing content?
Yeah, well, we do have one on our website, boa.org. It does have the whole checklist there for you. Things you want to think about, so is not so much your checklist, but to make sure that you have and you're having a complete audit done. So both automated and manual testing, and they should be done at the same time. So, and with automated scanning, that's going to go wide. It's going to hit all your public facing web pages. So it grabs that low hanging fruit. The other component to it is manual testing, which is it's a real important piece. And with manual testing, this is where you would put that content list or scope together of what pages will be manually tested. We look for unique pages, And when you do page testing, it's everything from the top to the middle and on the bottom. And we look for any pages that are unique and have unique elements on them. The other is if you have any functionality within your site, such as anytime an end user has to fill in multiple text boxes or hit multiple pages to complete a task, that's user accessibility testing or use case testing. So those are the components that you really need to look at along with your checkpoints in your list. You can have that list, but it's important that you look at the website as a whole as well, so that nothing does get missed.
The next question here is, what would be a good example of a website that complies with the ADA?
That's an excellent question. And there are some out there. The thing with that, you can look at a website that's complying, and and they're on top of it. They're doing their quarterly reviews. They're having, they're doing that constant checking and fixing of a website. And the reason it's very difficult to even give you a direct answer here is because a website can be accessible one day and not the next. Reason being is when you take into consideration all the different softwares, browsers, updates, assistive technologies, updates, it's like a website's almost like a living organism. So if I told you a site now and you went to it, you're probably going to find issues on it. So that's just unfortunately, I can't give you a direct answer there because of those reasons. But it is important that whatever your plan is that you have some sort of a monitoring plan in place, because as Dave mentioned, it's not a one and done deal. It's something you really need to build in to make sure that the site stays accessible.
Yeah, if you reach out to our contact information that we'll have on the last slide here, I mean, we can send you some examples of some sites where the organizations are very accessibility savvy and they're working hard to keep their website accessible. But as Kim said, tomorrow they could post their budget file up on the website and it wouldn't be accessible. It does happen.
True.
It does happen. So here's a good question. Can you give us an example of the size of the site and the cost to do the initial accessibility compliance? So the example says, let's say, for the sake of the discussion, it's a 20-page website and has 3 images on a page and 5 videos.
That is not, so with digital auditing, not just testing, but auditing, it has nothing to do with the size of a website. It's everything to do with complexity. How many human hours is it going to take to go in and do all that manual testing? That's literally what it boils down to. So for example, with what you're asking here, 20-page website, 3 images and 5 videos. If it's a complicated site, that will bring the number of hours up that it would take to go in and do all that manual testing. And if it's very simplistic or easy to use and navigate, and there's not a lot of complexity in there, it would take less time. And to give you a direct answer for that in regards to, an example of what it would cost, we would recommend that we would go in and examine the website to look for the pages, the use cases, the elements within it, because that's where what we would have to look at to give you something like a fixed investment for that.
Yeah, the one thing is with web content, you can have a simple website that has a lot of accessibility issues, and you have a really complex website that doesn't have as many accessibility issues, so it is very specific to the website. Somebody asked if the slides were going to be available, and thanked us for a great webinar. The slides typically aren't available. We normally would just have a recording of the webinar, but if you reach out to our contact information, if there's slide information you'd like me to share, just reach out. The next question was, we had an audit completed and are working through implementing the recommendations and are documenting that. Do you have a recommendation on how frequently to do a redo an audit? And it said they use WordPress and they've been advised that their platform should help them to remain compliant.
Well, I'm going to go back to like looking at a website as a living organism. It may help to keep certain things compliant, but The rule of thumb is that first, after you've done the main audit and your remediation, and you have to go into that maintenance mode. So the quarterly reviews, the scans, the updates, and all of that. Then the other thing is, according to some of the settlement cases the DOJ has on their website, it can be every 18 months to 2 years to do a complete full audit.
And the next question just asked if can they access the recorded session again in the presentation? And the answer is yes, it will be available on our website once the captioning is applied. We will post it up and send everybody an email that it's available to take a look at. So the next one is, we currently have an app for our organization that caters to customers with children with developmental disabilities. Where possible accessibility issues, since this app only caters to a specific disability. So I'm assuming this is probably like a browse aloud or something where it's helping people with maybe dyslexia or things like that, but it's not designed to replace a screen reader. I mean, my understanding of this, and Kim, you can tell me then your understanding, is you still fix your website for digital accessibility. You still do all the accessibility components of your website so it would work with all different assistive technologies. If you add then an additional function for somebody who has dyslexia, where you can change the fonts or blow the text up or do different things, I don't think there's anything non-accessible about that, as long as it does not break the accessibility of the website.
Yeah, Dave is correct. For your app, if it's built in accordance with the guidelines, assuming it's a web-based app, a native app, there's some other things that have to get checked, but assuming it's a web-based app, that needs to be built in accordance with the guidelines and tested using all sorts of assistive technologies. But Dave is correct. If it's built in accordance with the guidelines, it's been audited, it really shouldn't have any problems.
And the next question is, what is the best automated testing program?
There are many, 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 many of them out there. If you go, excuse me, if you go to the W3C's website, they have a list on there for you.
And the next question was, when we were asking about what the cost might be for a typical website, they said, could we give them a range?
Yeah, absolutely. A good range can be anything from, for a complete audit, say anywhere between 7,000, it can go way up to 25,000 plus. It's all based on the complexity. And that's why it's important when you're going through this process to have a scoping, we have a scoping call. And that's where we identify the unique pages, unique elements, and functionality or use case testing. And that's an exercise that you should absolutely have in order to get something that is a fixed investment for you. But that range, and I know it's enormous, but that's a very, that's pretty much what most things come in at. And that would be per website, so per domain. If you have multiple domains or multiple brands, that's where you would multiply that out. And once again, another reason why it's so very important that you have a scoping call so you know exactly what is going to be tested and what that investment is going to be.
And the next question says, where can we see good examples of accessible websites? I feel like we see more of what we shouldn't do and not what it should look like. We're going to be doing a webinar on Thursday on testing techniques, and that might give us the ability to show some good examples and some bad examples. But if you reach out to our contact information, I can give you probably some examples of some good websites. Yet the thing I think people need to understand is it doesn't eliminate your creativity as far as your website. It doesn't have to look like plain text and be simple to be accessible. And there's certainly things you can do creatively which can make the website very inaccessible, but it can also be very beautiful and very accessible at the same time. So we can get you some examples of that. The next question was just about, I'm going to download the transcript once the presentation is over. Will it close soon? Yes, we'll have that. We should have that available. Again, reach out to our information and I can send you the transcript ahead of when it gets captioned. Next question, what are some of the most common objections you hear from companies along the lines of why they can't or shouldn't have to make their content accessible?
That's a great question. And many times we'll hear it's too expensive. We have other things that are more important. Our website will look different. It'll change our brand, our colors. There are just so many objections out there. But there for every argument, there's always the reason why, and that is having an inclusive website application that you can have more customers, increase revenue, get your brand out there more, or being just one of those websites that are compliant. It's just good business to do, but there are so many objections out there. But once people and organizations are educated on what this is all about and the whys behind it, those objections usually go away.
And then the last two questions were just people thanking us. So very good. I thank you, everybody, for all of this. So with that, I'll stop with the questioning. Our contact information is up on the screen here. And so reach out if you did have any additional questions and some of the specific things that people had asked. And then finally, so we do have a whole series of these webinars that are going on into 2021. So feel free to go to our website and take a look at the webinars, and then the recorded and the captioned webinars that we previously have done are also there on our website. So feel free to take a look, and I want to thank everybody again for their time today. Been glad to see that we had some great questions. So obviously the content was relevant. Everybody be safe, and we'll see you soon on a future webinar. Thank you very much.